evening, everyone. Happy summer. Welcome to our July Silicon Valley Clean Energy meeting. As you probably can tell, I'm not Courtney, but I will be filling in for her this evening. So I'd like to call our meeting to order at 7:05, and we'll start with the roll call, please.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Vice Chair Abby Koga.
Here.
Alternate Director Bidbadal. Director Tate. Director Smith.
Here.
Director Miller.
Here.
Alternate Director Chang.
Here.
Alternate Director Schmidt.
Here.
Director Gibbons.
Here.
Director Craig.
Here.
Thank you, and I will note that Director Harney, Director Bruins, Director Rennie, and Director Cortese are absent.
Great. Thank you. So we will start with public comment on matters not listed on the agenda. The public may provide comments on any item not on the agenda. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. Do we have any public speakers? Nope. All right. If not, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Are there any items that any members would like to pull? Nope. Or questions, comments? Is there any member of the public who'd like to pull or comment on any items on the consent calendar? No?
I move the consent calendar.
Second.
Thank you. So motion by Member Miller, second by Member Tate. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to our regular calendar. We'll start with item number 2, the CEO report. Girish, take it away.
Thank you, Chair. Don't have too much over here. We'll have Hillary come up and give an update on legislative and regulatory, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce a new director we have today. We have Amy Bailey Gotway. She's our new Director of Decarbonization and Grid Innovation Programs. This is week 3 for her, but maybe you can take a minute to just say a few words.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Amy Bailey, the new Director of Decarbonization and Grid Innovation, and I'm super excited to be joining you guys and helping to develop some pretty ambitious greenhouse gas emissions targets and a roadmap, and implementing that roadmap to actually achieve them. So I've gotten to attend a CPAG meeting already, a MOG meeting, and I've had quite a few members of the community, and it's just really exciting how engaged everyone is, and I'm just looking forward very much to working with everyone in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Amy. In addition to this, I would like to call Hillary up to give us an update on legislative and regulatory issues.
Good evening, directors. I will keep this brief because the main item this month is one you'll be hearing more about later on the agenda. But to cover the top topics, so on PCIA, we are, if the timeline holds, only a couple weeks away from a proposed decision. So we should know much more about the future direction of that issue before the next board meeting. On resource adequacy, we just yesterday submitted testimony on our proposed structures for a 3 to 5 year local RA requirement with a centralized buyer. So broadly speaking, our strategy there has been to accommodate the centralized buyer mechanism on a temporary basis, and in the long term work through transmission and non-wires alternatives to try and basically reduce the occurrence of the sublocal constraints that drew the CPUC to ask for a centralized buyer in the first place. So that's going to be one of our big proceedings going into the fall. And then obviously the IRP is due on August 1st, and you'll be hearing more about that later. So those are the big ones on the regulatory side. And then on the legislative side, we are currently going into summer recess. So that runs a month from July 6th to August 6th. And the biggest bill that we are looking at right now that I'm sure a number of you are familiar with is SB 237, which would remove the current cap on direct access and reopen that for non-residential customers across the state. So broadly speaking, this is one that we are going to be looking at in greater depth with the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee, which is meeting next Tuesday. But there are three big priorities that we have when we look at the trajectory of this bill. The first is, how does this impact our decarbonization efforts? Because SVCE was founded to help decarbonize our communities, and we would like to see the direction of the industry be such that it helps further that mission. We are interested in the degree to which changes in the industry impact reinvestment in our communities. We feel that the work that we do, putting effort through programs and incentives back into the community is very important. And then the final one is how changes like this would impact visibility to the community. So right now, the customer base that is impacted by SB 237 accounts for a very large chunk of the emissions in our member communities. And we have an interest in ensuring that transparency and visibility for the community into planning for this portion of emissions is maintained. So those are the issues that we are going to be looking at as we decide on our course of action on this bill through the rest of the legislative session. And we'll have more updates after the end of the summer recess and our work with the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee. So that's the high points for this month. Does anybody have questions or comments?
Don't slow us down. If we could, we could. Let's keep going.
I was just going to.
Yep, we're good.
We're good. All right. I was just going to say thank you for that. And if things happen over the time that we don't have a meeting, I would look forward to having updates as appropriate.
Yes, we will send those out, and feel free to reach out if you have specific questions.
Thank you.
And that's the end of my report.
Oh, that's the end of your report too. Wow. All right. Any questions on Girish's report?
We appreciate that our chair is going to set a record meeting.
Well, I need the cooperation of everybody here. But so far, so good. All right, we'll keep going then. Number 3 is approving the SVCE Integrated Resource Plan. And that's Hillary.
I shouldn't have sat down. Well, I'll try to keep the trend going here. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. So, good evening, directors. This portion of the meeting is for reviewing SVCE's first integrated resource plan, which has been in the works for a while and which was included in your packet this month. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on the process, why IRP was created and why it's important, talk a little bit about how we approached developing the IRP, and then finally the results. Ooh. Sorry. There we go. So first of all, a very quick overview and reminder of where IRP came from. We here in the state have GHG mitigation goals for 2020, 2030, and 2050. The 2030 goal, which is 40% below 1990 levels, is the newest one. Governor Brown set it in 2015 through an executive order, and SB 350, which is one of our most recent major climate goals or major climate laws, was passed later that year with a whole slew of measures that were designed to help get the state on track to meet that goal. So one of those was integrated resource planning. And here is some of the key language from SB 350 that sets that. It directed the CPUC to be the agency that, that governs that process, and this is what they came up with. So integrated resource planning is going to be a rolling 2-year cycle with 4 main parts. We started off last fall at the CPUC, where they did statewide modeling to determine what our industry needs to achieve in aggregate in order to meet its portion of the statewide goal. Then the individual load-serving entities like us go out and build our plans. We submit those to the CPUC, which then aggregates them into the preferred system plan, which is a statewide estimate of where we are going to be if all LSEs procure according to their plans. And then finally, the CPUC compares the reference and preferred plans to see if there are any system-wide deficiencies on our trajectory for GHG mitigation and to talk about how we might correct those. So here's a quick overview of what we are submitting. You have one of these 3 pieces in front of you tonight. The biggest piece are the existing and new resource templates, which are the inputs that the CPUC staff need to do their statewide modeling. There's also the GHG calculator, which tells us where we are on our projected 2030 emissions, and then the written report for documenting process. And the important thing about this slide is to note that taken together, these materials produce a very different kind of document from what you may have seen from other CCAs. For example, MCE has voluntarily put out an IRP before that is more of a public-facing document, sort of an overview of the institution and its goals. This, the way it's evolved, has become very much a technical compliance document. It is not a vehicle for making new procurement decisions, but rather a vehicle for communicating to CPUC staff what we have already decided. So the key questions in a process like this are, how do you represent what you've already procured? How do you represent what you are planning to procure? And basically, how do you balance the needs of a modeling process with the realities of the procurement industry that we operate in? And broadly speaking, we try and move from reliance as heavily as possible on concrete data that we can pull directly from contracts to increasingly abstract components as we need to estimate. Because the fundamental challenge that we face in a process like this is trying to estimate outcomes that are on a longer time horizon than a lot of our procurement mechanisms operate on. So we move from existing contract data through mandates that we know we will have to accommodate from you, from the state, through historical data that we can use as a proxy for future energy delivery, and then finally to placeholders, which is another way of restating that we are not making new procurement commitments here. So in a place where the model requires us to provide a level of granularity that we cannot predict now, we put in placeholders to indicate that because we do value the flexibility to respond to market opportunities as they arise. So here's a more detailed example of that. I leave that mostly for your exploration, but it talks about some of the categories that we have to navigate when we are making estimates about future procurement, and a visual example of that on the issue of long-term versus short-term contracting, which in this particular case is centered around the SB 350 requirement that 65% of our RPS contracts be long-term by 2021. So let's talk about the portfolios. There are two in the report, a conforming and a preferred. These are very similar. Basically, the only difference between them is the load forecast, because the CPUC takes as its baseline assumption the load forecast in the 27 IPR report, which is an industry overview put out annually by the Energy Commission. But we expanded into Milpitas since the last IPR report was published. So the preferred portfolio is the one you should be looking at. That is the one that includes Milpitas and therefore has a higher load and also a higher allocated emissions benchmark. And the most important information on this slide is the rightmost column there, which is the allocated emissions limits for 2030 from the CPUC. So those are the numbers that we need to be on track to match or be below in 2030. So before we look at results, a quick note about GHG accounting, because the way that emissions are calculated in the IRP process is very different from the way they've been dealt with anywhere else in the state before, like, for example, in the annual emissions inventory done at the Air Resources Board. So there are two big divergences here. The methodology used is called the clean net short, and the biggest change is that, unlike a lot of energy programs that we're familiar with, like the annual emissions inventory or the renewable portfolio standard, the cap and trade program, those all operate on an annual basis. The methodology for emissions used in the IRP process works on an hourly basis. It goes through every year, hour by hour, and compares the projected load with the projected generation of GHG-free energy. And the thinking behind that is that as we move down the decarbonization curve as an industry, you start to run into phenomena like the duck curve that are occurring on very specific timestamps during the day. And in order to fully decarbonize the grid, we need to find a way to capture those in our emissions calculations so that we can identify them and devise solutions. So what that looks like in practice is an example like this. This is a day pulled from 2030, and it probably looks pretty familiar in terms of the general shape of production, but you can see what I did here is juxtaposed our load with our projected GHG-free generation. And as you might expect, in the middle of the day, we are generating more than our load, and in some parts of the evening and night, we're generating less than our load. And so the implication of a methodology like this is that unless you have a generation portfolio that is perfectly matched to your demand on an hour-by-hour basis, it is impossible to have a GHG-free portfolio by this methodology, because they are assuming that any demand not covered by your generation on an hourly basis comes from system power, which will have some emissions. So that is, in fact, very in line with what we get from the model. Here are our GHG emissions estimates from our two portfolios. And there are a couple takeaways from this. First of all, as we would expect, we have higher emissions from the preferred portfolio because when we expanded into Milpitas, we increased our load by about 21%. So as you'd imagine, more load, more emissions. The second thing is that our emissions are higher in 2018 than in any other year. And that is to be expected because one of the characteristics of the Clean Net Short methodology is that it excludes bucket 2 and 3 RPS resources entirely. And the thinking behind that is that because they are not scheduled dynamically into the state of California, they are difficult to fit into that hourly accounting basis because it's difficult to know what they're delivering at any particular hour of the day. So we feel very strongly that this is not an appropriate way to treat these resources. Their GHG-free attributes are in effect regardless of where they are located, and we worked and will be working with cpuc staff in future IRP cycles to find a way to fit them into this methodology, even though we think that on the whole moving towards an hourly accounting methodology is preferable. And then finally, the most important takeaway is that both of the portfolios are well under our emissions limit. We're coming in for both of them at about 35% of those limits that you saw on an earlier slide. So takeaways from the process. In terms of compliance, we are good to go. We're well under the limit, but I would say that, excuse me, in terms of the implications for our procurement and our programs going forward, hourly accounting for GHG emissions is very much the direction that the regulatory community is moving in. There are other conversations ongoing right now that could also end up incorporating something like this. For example, the AB 1110 implementation proceeding at the California Energy Commission, which will set how we calculate the GHG emissions intensity that is reported to our customers annually on the power content label. So I would say that there will be increasing importance of programs and resources that help us align our generation and our demand on an hourly basis. Things like storage, which we included in our recent RFO, things on the program side like demand response, coordinated EV charging, anything that helps us basically manage our matching more closely. And then finally, the IRP process is very much an iterative process. There was a very active conversation between the CCA staff community and the cpuc staff, and that continues and probably will continue through the last few weeks of July. So we anticipate working with them further to basically help us develop an IRP process that moves the state forward on decarbonization. So we will be turning this in. I ask tonight that you approve this plan. We will be turning it in on August 1st, and we look forward to working with cpuc staff this fall on the next steps of the process as they do their statewide modeling. Thank you very much. Questions and comments?
Thank you. Any questions from our members? Any members of, oh, yes,
well,
please.
I'm going to have to ask a question because we're just moving too fast. So when I was talking with a friend of mine about this, he loves to give me all these really interesting questions, and if you can't answer this, I don't really care, but I have to ask. He said, how do you know what the air quality was back in 1990? I mean, do we have a number? You would think that the tools for measuring air have changed over the past almost 30 years. So I'm just kind of curious. Is this just a number that somebody said 1990 and here's a number, you know? So we're going to go 40% below that.
Well, what they would be referring to in this case would be the estimated emissions in California in particular, as opposed to, for example, a CO2 ppm in the atmosphere globally. On that I don't know exactly off the top of my head when California began doing a formalized state annual emissions inventory. So if they were doing it in 1990, I would say they would pull it from that. If they were not, then likely they have calculated that that benchmark by going back and looking at things like records of economic activity, and then doing a modeling exercise that associates emissions inventory or emissions intensities with different types of commercial, industrial, residential activity.
Yeah, because I always notice they always give you a year, but they never give you a number.
That's true.
So it's just kind of an interesting. All right, let's get us back on track.
Thank you. That's a good question. Thanks for asking. Anyone else from the dais? If not, is there any member of the public wishing to speak on this item? Welcome, Mr. Carney.
Hello, I'm Bruce Carney from the city of Mountain View. It's disappointing, I'm sure, to realize that the state is likely to redefine clean as being dirty. And I applaud Hillary for trying to maintain PCC2 and PCC3 as clean resources. But I also want to say that I think the clean net short methodology, its time has come, and I hope that we won't resist focusing on that as a way to measure the success of our procurement of clean energy. I'm thinking of Hawaii, who is not connected to any other state's grids, has no alternative but to generate energy at the time that it's needed, and their goal is to be 100% renewable by 2045. There won't be any accounting trickery that Hawaii can use to say they achieved that goal when they haven't, and there shouldn't be any similar accounting mechanisms here in California. So it's tough. It strikes at the heart of the clean and Silicon Valley clean energy, at least in the short term. But I think this is pointing the state in the right direction, and I hope that we'll be able to move forward gracefully and outperform all the other CCEs.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? If not, I'll bring it back to our board.
Yes, I have a question from staff, to ask staff. On page 9, actually one of your presentations, the annual emission estimated by GHG calculator, which was one of your PowerPoint presentations. It shows a year 2030 is higher.
Yes,
Can you please explain that again, because Milpitas is new, maybe we're not understanding it as quickly, but
no,
you're wanted to clarify, because every year is going down except that year it's going up.
You're entirely correct. You're looking at table 1,
yes,
the rightmost column.
It's table 2, actually.
Let's see.
GHG on page 9. You had a presentation on it as well.
The emission results.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sorry, let me go back to that slide. Okay.
See, I'm trying to slow down the meeting.
So you're looking at the 2030 emissions?
Yes. So you have 2018, you have preferred and conforming, and you had the comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
The 2018 is identical to 2030, yet 2022 was going down, and so was 2026. 2030 is the same exact number as 2018.
So
can we switch to that slide so that the public can see what we're talking about?
Oh, sorry.
Perfect.
Didn't realize I was the only one who could see that. So you're saying, why does it go back to the 2018 number?
Yes.
Yeah, so the idea there is that the initial decrease in emissions is partly caused by phasing PCC2 out of our portfolio, because the 2018 numbers include all of our current contracts, which have a sizable portion of PCC2. So we see a drop in 2022 as those PCC2 contracts roll off and are replaced by PCC1, according to prior conversations we've had at board meetings. And then we do see a gradual increase in load. So I would say I would not attach any particular significance to the fact that the 2018 and 2030 numbers match there, but the general pattern of increasing through increasing load, and also potentially things like the amount of storage that we've procured are causing the increase towards 2030. Okay. So, and we start, obviously, the 2018 numbers are the same across portfolios because we have the same contracts in place.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Yeah, I want to agree with Mr. Carney about the clean net short being a better model. It's much more accurate, I think. And all of us as cities have to do greenhouse gas inventories. That's using, I think, a very different model. I don't know if this is a question for Betty later on, or if you could provide insights into whether the citywide emissions inventories are also going to have to adopt this type of approach at some point.
That is not something that I have visibility into.
Okay.
But it is spreading across the energy community, so I don't know if there will be cross-pollination there or not.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
something we can cover on down later in the meeting.
If one thing I'll say about that in addition, I mean, there could be a whole other presentation on GHG accounting methodology, but one of the reasons that that there was so much controversy around the selection of the clean net shore methodology is it is one of the first times that we have had to do load-based accounting. Something like the annual emissions inventory looks at sources of emissions, but it does not have to consider where those emissions end up in terms of being assigned to end users. So that was sort of a new challenge, and that's why there was a very protracted conversation in the IRP proceeding about what methodology should be selected, and obviously it finally led to this. So,
Any other questions or comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion. Do we need to approve this item?
So
Motion
moved.
to,
Yeah. I'm sorry. I missed that.
I'll move to approve or
second. Second.
Right. So motion by,
I'll move to approve the staff recommendation.
great. So motion by Member Smith, second by Member Bipedal. Any other comments? If not, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstentions, motion passes. Thank you. Moving on to item 4, approve the strategic plan update. And we're back to Girish.
Chair Abikoga, members of the board, I'd like to present an update to our strategic plan. Last year you adopted a strategic plan, and as Tom wrote in the introduction, the strategic plan is meant to be a living document, and I think this strategic plan it's a little bit public facing, and it's quite a bit internal facing, but given that we are a new organization, I think it makes a lot of sense to basically put even these internal facing tactics, etc., which are quite detailed, out there so that everyone in the community knows exactly what we are planning to do. So this year, I'd say what we've done is a tune-up to basically correct some dates, make a few changes, and your board report, and I'm going to go through the presentation to show you what the minor changes that were made, major changes, and one or two things that have to be determined in the coming year. Talked about this. And so going through about 6 different categories in the strategic plan, I'm going to go through what the minor changes were, major changes, and I plan to bring back another version of the strategic plan maybe in the first quarter of 2019. So we've been talking about we can do a bit more, because by the end of 2018, we'll have our roadmap, our decarbonization roadmap. We'll have some goals on what we want to achieve on decarbonization in 2025 and 2030. I think we'd be able to flesh out a few more strategies based on that. And if we get it to you in the first quarter of 2019, I think we can have our budget workshop soon after that, kind of streamline some of our processes. Sorry. So over here, the major change is having a once in 2 years compensation study and rewarding staff to keep them engaged. By the way, we did go over the strategic plan with the executive committee, and we've incorporated the comments that the committee has made to it. On customer and community, I'd say the highlight in this is actually the 2 things. The major changes, we want to create an SVCE Customer Resource Center as we go into a phase of implementing programs. We should be having our website be a lot more populated with information and knowledge that customers can use to make decisions. So Don and his group have been talking about this, so we want to highlight this in our strategic plan. And the last bullet here, TBD next update, this is probably a pretty big change, and strategically I think you're all going to be very interested in talking about this at the first quarter of next year, which is we need to have our goals on what we plan to do with our emissions, what we want to achieve in 25 and 30. Today we have a goal to reduce our emissions as of 2021. And though that was, I'd say, we created that without too much of analysis, I think it's still a okay goal, but I think part of the work that Amy and Don are going to be doing in the next several months will validate even the 2021 goal and come up with goals for 25 and 30. On the finance and fiscal responsibility side, we want to provide you a 5-year forecast twice a year, whereas previously we were going to provide it to you once a year. And although we say we're reducing this from 10 years to 5 years, we'll continue to provide, say, the Risk Oversight Committee these long-term forecasts, because we are entering into 15 and 20-year contracts, and so we will have financial forecasts that go out long-term. But essentially a 5-year forecast from a board perspective, what we were thinking is you need to know where your reserves could be in the next 5 years and what rates could be like in the next 5 years. So having this provided to you twice a year is more actionable, and so that was the change. On the regulatory and legislative side, we have actually started down this path of contributing more to SVCEA. They have staffed up. They have 2 new staff members from 1 that they had for more than a year, and they are looking for 2 more. So that's something that we continue to work on. On the power supply side, in the major changes, we are looking at distributed resources. So we plan to, in fall, winter of this year, issue an RFP for local distributed resources. So we can have some solar energy storage facilities in our service area. And also looking at managing market price credit risks. Monica and her group are going to be looking at taking on some tasks that are currently done by consultants, bring that in-house. So there'll be, we'll still continue to outsource some of our risk management and portfolio management analysis, but we are going to bring some of that in-house. On information technology, we've rewritten a lot of what's in the strategic plan. When we first wrote it, we did not have Nick Zanato, who's our IT supervisor. Well, so he has actually rewritten a lot of what we are doing currently, and so we'll continue on that. So that's the end of my presentation. We have a red line copy also in the attachment, open for any questions or comments, and we will be bringing back another version to you in the first quarter of 2019.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the dais? Yes, Member Cheng.
On the IT portion, do we emphasize or put a little bit emphasis on the privacy, keeping the privacy of the customer, we protecting the privacy of the customer? We have.
Yeah, so if I could answer that in terms of, yes, we have certain laws that we have to follow, but in addition to that, last year we did an audit, a cybersecurity audit, and there are a number of ways. Cybersecurity is a very big issue, and how we can keep customer data safe. So Don has actually set aside money to do a new audit in the coming year, and so that's how we'll continue to proactively deal with privacy concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Questions, Member Schmidt?
On the Customer Resource Center, it sounds like a physical location or online or?
Online.
Online, thanks.
Anyone else from the dais? Questions? No? If not, I'll open this up for public comment. Any member of the public wishing to speak, please come forward. No? All right, well, I'll bring it back to the dais then. Are there comments by members? And if not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
I would make a motion.
I'm sorry, did you have a comment?
I'll second.
So a motion by Member Gibbons. Is there a second?
Yes, second.
By Member Patel. Any other comments? If not, all
Actually-
those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Oh, I'm sorry, there's, oh.
It's okay, I was
please.
just going to say, just very shortly, I was going to commend the staff for the great work you've been doing on the, understanding that our organization is new and it's evolving, and we need to reevaluate our programs and basically make changes and adjust it based on the growth of the organization, because we're like a startup company and we're out of the startup phase, so we're going into being more established. So I just wanted to say those comments. You did excellent work as I read the report. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I would agree. And I remember last year going through the strategic plan and some comments about how it was maybe too outward looking, but I think that really has actually served us well. And obviously it'll evolve over time, but I appreciate the hard work that's been put into this too. So with that, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 5, the proposed fiscal year 2018-19 operating budget. This is a discussion that we will have a presentation by Don Eckert, our Director of Finance and Administration. Welcome.
I'm not sure you should believe what I'm telling you because I'm the stupid one that wore a tie, or you should believe what I'm telling you because I'm the only one that wore a tie. But I'll let you decide. All right, thank you. And just as before we get started with the budget, just as a reminder, because we are set up a little differently than your member agencies, our fiscal year starts October 1st to September 30th, and this item is not a voting item; it's for discussion only tonight. And we do want to get feedback from the board as well as the general public. So just to review where we stand on the budget calendar. So we've gone through the priorities presentation back in April, presented a very preliminary preview with the Finance and Administration Committee in May. Then we brought back a amended reserves policy in June. You just voted on the strategic plan, which becomes our guidebook for creating the budget. And then we'll talk about the proposed budget now. Then in July, later this month, we're meeting with the Finance and Administration Committee again to discuss compensation and benefits, which feeds into this budget. We'll then bring a first draft of the recommended budget for review with the Finance and Administration Committee in September, and then bring to you a recommended budget for adoption at the September board meeting. So the highlights out of this proposed budget for tonight is, first off, SVCE is financially stable. We're going to end this fiscal year with around $70 million of unrestricted cash. This budget, as it stands right now, there's going to be some changes in the assumptions, and we'll talk more about that in the presentation, would produce around an additional $58.1 million of balance available for reserves. A big change to this budget that in fact impacted us on the power supply, revenues, as well as billing services is a full year of the city of Milpitas, so thank you. And in this mid-year budget, we had Milpitas since coming online in June, so we only had 4 months, now we have a full 12, and it does make an impact in this budget. And then lastly, we do have some major risk factors to talk about, including rates and as well as where we're going with the PCIA, and we'll cover that in the next steps portion of the presentation. So let's get right into the numbers. So the bottom line, comparing this proposed budget to the mid-year, we're looking at a $7.8 million increase in surplus. You go to the far left, our revenues have a favorable adjustment of $31.9 million. Again, full year of the city of Milpitas, assuming with the current load, not including Milpitas, is around 0.5% growth. Talked about the rates and the PCIA as a risk factor. We're assuming in this budget, because we don't have a lot of complete information yet, that we're assuming no changes on rates for 2019, as well as the PCIA, and that's definitely something we'll bring back to you in what those changes will be in the recommended budget. And then we saw an increase in investment income only because we have a larger balance to invest in, as well as in a rising interest rate market. Power supply, 25.1 million increase in power supply costs. Obviously, most of that is to serve the city of Milpitas, but also we assumed about a $5 million impact in this budget based on what Hillary presented to you. With any open PCC2 positions in this power supply budget, we're assuming is going to be filled with PCC1 because of that regulatory risk, and that did add about $5 million to the power supply budget. But the good news is most of the energy is hedged, and nearly all of the resource adequacy or capacity is hedged in this fiscal year power supply budget. Billing services, slight increase in the rate per meter from PG&E, minimal impact. Other operating, 3.7 million increase in other operating costs. This would include professional services, employment expenses, marketing, capital. And so just to give you the highlights of those major impacts would be the employment expenses. We have 4 new positions in this budget. We'll cover it in a slide on the table of organization. We also built contingency for compensation and benefits. We don't know where we're going to land on that yet, but we built contingency in this budget for that. As well as we're assuming those 25 positions are filled for a full 12 months. When you compare that to the mid-year, we did have vacancies that accounted for that mid-year number. Marketing expenses did increase, mainly to support the initiatives that we presented to you during the budget priorities presentation, such as customer awareness with change in the time of use rates, a web portal, again, for more customer awareness, and I believe we'll be continuing this GHG accounting process that you'll get a briefing on tonight. Capital and capital expenses as well as lease expenses increased for the office expansion that we're anticipating. We're going through negotiations now with the landlord, and we should have a lease to the Finance and Administration Committee for review in September and then bring that to the board. And then professional services also increased for various legislative and regulatory support, as well as we will be going in the market for an RFO and distributed energy resources, as well as we may do another RFO for the long-term power purchase agreements, and those do require professional services support. Debt service, we're anticipating no new debt issuance for this fiscal year. And then programs is formula-based, so as you see an increase in energy sales, also the programs budget increased along with that. This next slide is just gets into the details of the numbers.
Quick question.
I'm sorry, can we
Yes.
take questions?
Just one quick question on that last slide. So LA had really high heat last week, and it affected their electric issues a lot. So if we were to have a really bad month and it was really hot, would that show up in one of these boxes? Is that where the hedging comes in?
Yeah, that's where the hedge would come in. If we have to go out and procure more power because of a very hot month, we also would like to balance it out with probably better sales as well. So it's and we'll cover that in a risk slide too of what that impact might be in the power supply. But yeah, we would cover that with also increased sales.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, another question here. Member Gibbons.
So this will probably get answered. I was thinking natural disasters. I wanted to make sure we cover how we handle the risk of natural disasters.
Okay.
They're likely.
And we do have some contingency built on the power supply side. I'm going to show you on a slide here at the end talking about a power supply shock and what that would do to our bottom line. So I'll answer that question in a moment.
Yeah, we all remember what happened to the Moss Landing power plant.
Oh, okay. We would buy it from CAISO probably and be covered there. So there might be some real-time pricing impact to the power supply, but overall we should be okay. So I'll skip the slide. Just this goes into the details of the budget, and bottom line is the $58 million surplus. Just looking at revenues, you can see that on the left side, our energy sales, we're looking at about 4 million or 4,000 gigawatt hour sales for this coming fiscal year. And as far as number of accounts, you can see, not a surprise that most of the accounts are residential, but you'll see shortly that most of the revenue comes on the commercial industrial side. But we're looking at around 256,000 accounts on any given month, of which that's about a 25,000 account increase because of the city of Milpitas. Then on cash flow, 286.2 million of cash inflow, and that's almost 68 cents for every dollar comes from the C&I side. Other income would be items such as wholesale activity, investment income. Residential is around 30%, and then other retail would be agricultural, street lighting. On the cash outflow side, about 228.1 million, and 91 cents of every dollar that goes out the door is power supply related. And you can see that we have very low fixed costs. That keeps us nimble, gives us a chance to react quickly when those market opportunities occur. So we have very low fixed cost. Mention about the personnel, we have 4 new positions that we have in this proposed budget. This gives us an FTE count now of 25. Currently we're at 21. So net of 4 new positions, with the focus is on power supply, support of programs, and then 1 position for administration. So on the far left, under finance, the green box would be a reclassification. So currently I have 2 administrative analysts, proposing to reclassify those to management analysts based on the diversity of duties that they do perform. And then adding in the yellow box would be a new position, administrative analyst, with a primary focus on human resources support, but also helping out on other as backup duties for finance as well. Director of customer care, and in that area we're looking at reclassification of the account rep 1 and account rep 2 positions to be called energy consultant, as their duties are not just to straighten out billing questions from a customer, but also to bring about it, to provide advice and work with customers on the various programs that we're going to be offering. So we feel it's prudent to change the title to what the duties that they will be performing. And then add 2 new positions as an associate energy consultant. And then under the community outreach manager, currently there is 1 community outreach specialist. We're proposing to increase that to 2. We're currently filling that with a temporary position, so we would eliminate that temporary position and move them in full-time, so not much fiscal impact. Under Director of Power Resources, we have in the mid-year budget 1 power settlements and compliance analyst. We would increase that to 2, but we would pay for that by eliminating one of the positions that we had under the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs group, which was the associate analyst. And then under the Director of Decarbonization and Grid Innovations programs, we have the 2 to-be-determined positions that were approved in the mid-year budget. However, those are going to get trued up this summer now that we have Amy here with job descriptions, salary ranges, and we'll bring that back to the board at the September board meeting. Also want to touch upon a concept that Grish and I have been talking about, which is broadbanding. To the left is a traditional broadbanding that you may be familiar with when you think about personnel salaries, where you condense the ranges of, instead of having 6 job titles with 6 job salary ranges, you would condense that to a band 1 or a band 2. It provides flexibility sometimes in large organizations. That's a traditional broadbanding. What we're proposing tonight is a hybrid approach to that, where we're not necessarily looking to get rid of the number of job classifications or even salary ranges, but to have that flexibility to be able to move people up when those opportunities and when their experience is there. And so in this case, I have an example of a senior analyst, an analyst, and an associate analyst, and we may currently be at an associate analyst and an analyst, but we'd like to have in the table of organization a senior analyst. Don't necessarily have to fund it yet, but it would be a situation where we would we could have 25 funded FTEs that have a table of organization of 28 boxes. And it, again, gives us that flexibility to move employees around. Again, we're not getting away from a job description or salary ranges for each one of these boxes. And also we're talking about even horizontal broadbanding of positions, because there's going to be some overlap of needs between power supply, marketing, and programs as well. And those are all kind of being sorted out internally. But we would like to get some feedback tonight if that is a concept that staff should pursue either for the September board meeting or certainly by the end of the year, if there's some interest in presenting a TO that would be funded with 25 positions but may have 28 boxes. And so we could cover that at the end of the presentation as well. And here's a risk slide I put together, and I think of three major risks. There are others out there, but certainly there's a risk on rates. And so if you look at PG&E right now, we're 6% below PG&E rates. If they were to drop their rates by 3%, I think we're in pretty good shape that we could leave our rates fairly stable. But in the June filing of the ERRA forecast, they show rates dropping by 10 to 15%. I wouldn't put a lot of faith in that yet, because last summer they were going to drop it 1.5% and they raised it 10. So we don't know where that's going to go. But so I'd like to show here is just some sensitivity analysis considering a worst case scenario. And so let's say rates were to go down by 10% for us, and we cut rates by 10%. That's about $22 million reduction in base rate revenues. Now the PCIA is another risk. I'm assuming no change right now in the PCIA. However, we're going to have better information at the end of this month on a proposed decision of where the PCIA is going. So just assume a large increase in PCIA of 25%. And that 25% would be covered by our margin, not the ratepayers. And then to your point, Director Gibbons, as far as a power supply shock, let's say we're off by 3%. You can see a reduction in our net surplus by about 46 million. If all three of these scenarios were to happen, and I look at this as more of a stress test, we're still in business. So that's the good news on that. I actually do think it's very possible that rates can come down, and the PCA will definitely go up, and we will be off by 1 to 3% on power supply. I just think that rates going down by 10% is an extreme. I think 25% for PCIA is an extreme, and we're still in business. Okay, so that should give you a better feeling of where we are.
This is a wonderful slide. Thank you for this.
Thank you. All right. And our next steps. So I'd like to get feedback tonight from either the board or as well as the general public. We want to reforecast over the next month our performance with PEA. We'll have a better idea of base rate revenues. I'm not sure I'm going to know in August exactly where PG&E is going to land, but I'll get some advice from PEA and we'll build that into the recommended budget. We'll also then update our power supply with the latest positions. We'll have a better direction on the PCIA at the end of this month, as I mentioned earlier. We'll refine our other operating expenses. We'll relook at the table of organization, have a third and fourth look at other operating expenses such as marketing and professional service to make sure that we're good with those numbers. We intend to present a draft of the recommended budget at the September 5th Finance and Administration Committee, and then bring it back to this board on September 12th for adoption. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any questions from members of the board? We'll just do questions now, and then I'll open it for public and then bring it back. So, other questions? No? All right. I will open this up to public comment. Any member of the public wishing to speak, please come forward. I see a hand being raised, but I'm not. Oh, okay. All right, if not, I'll bring it back to the board for comments. We'll start with Director Gibbons.
Thank you. I think we've already heard the slides are really excellent, and I think I'm seeing a great maturity of how we're conveying information, learning information at the board meeting, but also how staff is leading the board in previous meetings and at subcommittee meetings through the information. And I think that gives us a chance to mull over some complicated and difficult things. So I'm very pleased to support what's happening here because I think we've been brought along and well informed, and I thank staff for that.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Staff sounded like they wanted feedback on some of the job title situation and the banding, and I'm perfectly happy with the hybrid approach. I really think, and I'll look to Girish on this one, in a small company being highly flexible with job titles matters a lot for people professionally, and so I think be very flexible with job titles and be very structured in how we pay is the right answer. So multiple bands, and if people need to be the king of pizza, let's make them the king of pizza. I mean, whatever job titles need to be professionally doing their job. Maybe king of pizza is not the best. I was just in Japan. There was no pizza, so I'm sorry.
Let's have Pizza Hut.
I need pizza. Somebody's going to become king of pizza now, I know it. But whatever title, I'm less worried about the title. I get the senior and all that kind of matters, but there could be other attributes to the title that would make a big difference. But I like a hybrid approach to the pay scales is what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Great. Yes. Director.
Thank you, and I also agree as well, since you're looking for feedback from last couple of meetings, actually last meeting, I know a lot of the board members were talking about retention is an important factor. And it is a cost-saving factor for the organization. You want to retain your good employees. So I think this is going to give us the flexibility needed in order to keep the employees rather than have them go to competing agencies. And I know soon we're going to have competing agencies even close by. So this is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments? No? Yes, Director Tate, did you raise your hand? Or? No.
No, I just
okay.
agree with her.
Okay, great.
I don't see any downsides whatsoever.
Yeah. Did you have a comment, Director Smith?
Well, I appreciate the effort and thought that has gone into this budget, and I also agree that the broadbanding as proposed is a good idea for the size of this organization, and we can certainly revisit it as we grow. And for me, the thing is, I'll be interested in seeing what the risk update is at the September meeting, because I think that's where there's so many things pending that it's the best that we know at the moment, and there will be more to hear about. So, looking forward to September.
Great. Any other comments here? I would just, first of all, thank you for all the work on the budget. And in terms of the banding, I think I also agree it's a good idea. I guess at first I had the question of, could that then mean you could have like all senior analysts and no analysts or associate analysts at some point if everybody's moving up? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, I guess.
Yeah, it is possible.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're keeping people for a couple of years and they perform at a high level, you promote them to senior, and so at some point you may have 2 senior analysts, and then one leaves, and then you recruit. Depending on the level of qualifications you get, you may hire at the associate level. So it really goes back to giving the manager flexibility based on the needs that the manager would have at that period of time.
Right. Well, yes.
On that point, I think it's one to stress, as we've heard already, there's flexibility in this structure. And given the marketplace, this allows not only a flexibility of what position to be filled, whoever, depending on who comes and applies. And we don't want to lose somebody if we need that, but we want to take advantage of young talent as well. So that's why I really like the flexibility of addressing the marketplace and the organization maturing.
Any other comments? I just had I had a question I asked earlier about the timeline of the budget cycle. I didn't realize we were on this October budget cycle, and I think most of our cities or public agencies are on a July 1st fiscal year cycle, and my own personal interest or desire was and to see if we could maybe move it to that cycle to be in sync with all of our cities, and is that a possibility and something we can entertain?
Yeah, great question. So originally when the fiscal year was set up the way it is, it was more to accommodate the credit agreement. We don't have that restriction now. However, a plus to keep the fiscal year the way it is could be for financial reporting consistency until we achieve a credit rating. Okay. But give us a chance to relook at the pros and cons. We'll run it first by the Finance Administration Committee and get back to you in September on that.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. Yes.
I remember some conversations about what we should do, and I couldn't quite remember why we got where we got. But I did think that all of us have a lot of, I think, extra work in the April, May, or May, June timeframe doing our city budgets. So I think having this at a different cycle would help me. And then doing it in the November, December timeframe is difficult because of the holidays and so forth. So I think inadvertently this kind of works for now.
Okay. Yeah, well, definitely if it's something we can revisit down the road, that'd be great. Anything else? I think there's nothing to act on tonight, so we will have this back at our September meeting for final approval. Thank you. Moving on to item 6, our SVCE baseline greenhouse gas accounting and energy metrics data. Yes, I think what we've all been waiting for all night. And our staff Director of Account Services and Customer Relations, Don Brave, will be giving the presentation. Welcome. It looks like he has some partners. Hi.
All right, thank you, Chair, and good evening, directors. At the direction of the board, SVC staff has been working very hard over the last several months with consultants from DNV-GL on putting together a GHG and energy asset baseline. And we'd like to take you through some of the key results from that work here tonight. I am joined by Betty Sato of DNV-GL. I want to make sure I get the title right. Betty leads the Sustainable Buildings and Communities Department, and she and DNV-GL staff that work with Betty have been a great resource for us. We're going to go through a lot of detail here tonight, and we're going to tag team this a little bit. I'd like to suggest that maybe we hold longer questions till the end, so we'll try and spin all the way through this. And I know we're trying to set a record here tonight, but we'll go through it fairly quickly. If you have short questions of clarification, we can take those. Otherwise, we'll save the hard ones for the end. Okay. So by way of background, you all know that GHG emissions reduction is key to our mission. And to guide us in our goal setting and program development and performance tracking efforts, we want to put together data sets that will enable us to do that. So where do we stand GHG-wise? What's our starting point, and where do we intend to go? We've worked really closely with our member agency working group in this. So staff from majority of our jurisdictions have been involved with us in this. We've put together some very detailed data sets that we're making available to all of them, and we intend to update these data sets annually. So these should be a real resource to the communities for tracking emissions performance over time. So specifically in terms of the data sets that we've created, we've put together a baseline for the year 2015. So we've looked across all 13 of our communities at emissions from the built environment, that means electricity and natural gas, and from transportation. These are things that SVCE and our future work can affect emissions in, built environment and transportation. So we're going to show you what that total for 2015 looks like. Why 2015? Well, it's before we were in place. So it's in effect kind of the starting conditions. Then we've updated that emissions inventory for 2017, which is going to show us what we've accomplished over this last year. And about half of this previous year, 2017, SVCE was in place. We started in April, and we're really up and running for many of our communities by July. So that equates to about half a year. It's important to note that Milpitas is not in this yet. We're going to see PG&E's emissions in the Milpitas numbers. We will attempt to project what a full year's worth of impact for SVCE will be. That's kind of important to us as we plan going forward, so we'll share that with you. And then finally, we've put together what we're calling an energy asset baseline. So we're looking at a bunch of important related data: energy use demographics, our building stock, occupancy, energy usage by building type and location and so forth, distributed resources, where are we with solar, where are we with storage, alternative forms of generation. Again, important baseline data because we intend to move some of these needles into the future. And finally, electric vehicles. How many vehicles do we have in our service territory? How many of them are electric? What's the growth rate? So we've pulled together a lot of information in all these categories, and now we're going to move through it quickly here and share with you. Okay, probably the most important number tonight, 4.2 million metric tons of CO2. That's what we're going to consider our 2015 baseline number for the built environment and transportation across our service territory. It's broken out, as you can see in the pie here, about 26% from electricity, that's residential, non-res, and DA, that's the green slices of the pie. Coincidentally, another 26% from gas, and that's commercial and residential gas use, and then 43% across various transportation-related slices of the pie. That cross-hatched 5% is emissions that would often be in an inventory that are not related to the built environment or transportation. So water, wastewater, and other categories. We have not attempted to estimate those. They're usually a pretty small fraction of any given jurisdiction's overall GHG pie. So on average, these numbers we're showing you are going to be about 95% of what would be in a city's typical inventory. Looking at the stacked bar, it really isn't a stacked bar, it's a single bar over on the right. We're now showing you what our target 30% GHG reduction by 2021 would look like. So we have a standing goal, which we established in our strategic plan, and it was a directional goal of about a 30% reduction across our service territory. That would take us down to close to 3 million metric tons CO2e. So directionally, that's where we're headed. Girish talked earlier about the fact that in our program planning work coming up, we're going to be looking at 2025 and 2030 goals. We're going to be thinking about how we move towards 2021 and beyond, how we start to reshape different parts of this pie to get there. So there's a lot of planning and projection work to be done, but we've established the baseline to work from. So now Betty is going to take you through 2017's results and talk specifically about how different pieces of the pie have changed in just the 2 years since the initial baseline.
All right, thank you so much, Dawn. So, so my job, as I see it tonight, is to help you digest the pie, break it down slice by slice, and help you to understand the trends and the data, and ultimately the implications for SVCE in achieving the goals of its own organizational goals, but also the climate and energy goals of the member agencies. So as Dawn had presented, here's a 2015 pie. The big chunks here are, the blue, as Dawn had mentioned, transportation, the green, which is electricity, and then the brown and yellow, which is natural gas. So when we reran the emissions inventory for 2017, you can see that the pie as a whole does decrease, and it decreases about 13% between 2015 and 2017. And as Dawn mentioned, 2017 is not a complete rollout year for SVCEA and does not include Milpitas. So the 13% is a snapshot for 2017. And then we also looked at what a full rollout looks like, which Dawn will cover a little bit later. So I want to just go back to this electricity. So the 13% reduction is largely driven by the electricity consumption or electricity sector here. So you'll see from 2015 to 2017, the size of the electricity wedge decreases by about half. And that is largely driven by the emissions factor, not surprisingly. So starting with SVCE, here, the emissions in 2017 are estimated to be about 0.25 pounds per megawatt hour. So that's the emissions factor per unit of energy consumption. And it has a small amount of emissions associated with the geothermal power that was procured in 2017. But I understand that that's being phased out. And it is using the industry methodology of the climate registry. So within the service territory, there are PG&E, and there's also direct access. So the other trends that we're seeing in the region are PG&E's emissions factor is also decreasing, obviously not as significantly as SVCE, but it is complying with the state RPS. One thing to note is in this table, the PG&E emissions factor is not yet available for 2017, so we're using the 2016 emissions factor as a proxy. And then direct access, we've talked a little bit about the changing landscape for direct access, but direct access does comprise about 23% of the electricity consumed in the service territory. And in this case, we used a direct access emissions factor that's modified to account for the large commercial customers who have committed to procuring 100% carbon-free electricity through direct access. So we want to acknowledge that some of the customers in the service territory are taking action on their own, and that's accounted for in our estimation here that the emissions factor overall for all electricity consumed within the 13 jurisdictions is decreased by half between 2015 and 2017. So, all right, so diving into each portion of the pie here, starting with electricity. So what's driving some of the trends that we're seeing? We are seeing a very small decrease in electricity consumption in the service territory, and this is despite the fact that 2017 was the hottest year on record. So that's a kudos to all of our energy efficiency efforts that we have been working on for so long. And to break it down by sector, we are seeing a slightly bigger decrease in electricity usage in the non-residential sector, and also a small decrease overall in the residential sector as well, despite growth. I want to point that out. So the impacts on electricity, though, are primarily driven by the emissions factor that we just mentioned. So even though there's a 2.6% decrease in consumption, we're seeing a 47% decrease in total emissions. And as I mentioned, part of it is due to SVCE, but part of it is also due to PG&E and the reduced consumption. So what's interesting is, let's see. Oops. So you see a larger decrease in non-residential consumption, but when you look at the biggest reductions in emissions, it's actually the residential sector because more of them have moved to SVCE. So that's really part of the impact of SVCE and its near carbon-free electricity. So moving those customers to cleaner sources of power is going to continue to be a really important piece of meeting the SVCE emissions reduction goal. So natural gas, interestingly, you know, natural gas shows a opposite trend to electricity. You see an increase in natural gas consumption between 2015 and 2017. And we're not completely sure why, because 2017 was a very warm year compared to the previous years. And so when we started looking at, okay, what might be driving that? We see a small increase in natural gas consumption in the non-residential sector, and a much bigger increase in the residential natural gas consumption. So I don't know if that's due to, you know, people wanting those gas cooking stoves or, you know, it's hard to say. We've speculated it a little bit, but, you know, haven't really come to any clear, you know, reason here. And one thing to note is that the emissions factor for natural gas combustion stays constant. So we're not going to show you an emissions graph. It's identical to what you see here. It's a slight 3.1% increase in emissions related to natural gas between 2015 and 2017. So the third major sort of portion of the emissions pie is on-road transportation. And here we see some interesting trends related to a slight increase in total vehicle miles traveled in the service territory. You'll note that the light blue parts of the graph, or the bars, are related to gasoline and diesel, so internal combustion engines. And this very small piece we're beginning to see in this green part of the bar related to electric vehicles. So even though we see a 30% increase in EV miles traveled, when you look at, you know, where it is relative to the internal combustion engines, it's still a pretty small part of the overall vehicle fleet. But despite the increase in vehicle miles traveled, we do see about a 4% decrease in emissions. And this is primarily driven by the fact that vehicles are getting cleaner. CAFE standards are, you know, ratcheting up. Older vehicles are being replaced by newer, more efficient vehicles. So even the internal combustion engines are getting more efficient. So across the region and across the state, we're seeing that although people are driving more miles, the overall emissions is coming down because the vehicles are getting cleaner. But obviously we need to make a step change here, and this is where electric vehicles play a really important role. So I think with that, I'll let Don share the key takeaway here.
Tackle the next couple slides. So if we look at our 2015 baseline of about 4.2 million metric tons, and if we look at our 2017 actual results, you can see we're down by about 13%. If we consider full implementation of SVCE, so SVCE now deployed into Milpitas and for an entire year across our service territory, we've modeled that the impact to this graph would be about a 20% reduction, okay? So if we think about the 30% target we have for 2021, we're already about 2/3 of the way there. That doesn't mean the remaining 10% is going to be easy. You know, the lift is going to start to get harder because we really have to go after those new pieces of the pie. We have to go after residential and commercial gas use. We have to continue to electrify transportation, and there is some remaining emissions from electricity and indirect access. So this is an important chart to look at, and we'll be coming back to this in a lot more detail in the next 6 months as we really do our program planning and projection work relative to where we are. Okay, so that's it for the GHG accounting portion of what we've done, and now we're going to talk about the asset baseline. Specifically, we're going to look at energy use demographics. We're going to look at the current status of distributed resources in our service territory, and we're going to look at some transportation trends, especially as it relates to EV adoption and expansion of EVSE, basically charging equipment in our service territory. So do you want to take it, Betty?
Yes. All right, so let's explore. So as Don mentioned, so we're going to start with the energy use demographics. So this is where we explore how and where electricity is used across the service territory. And I think these city-specific charts will be extremely interesting to each and every one of you. So first of all, so we divide electricity consumption into residential versus non-residential. And non-residential is, commercial, it's industrial, it's institutional, it's government. It's basically everything that's not residential. And so these bars show you the average monthly electricity consumption in 2017 by city. So not surprisingly, Sunnyvale is showing the highest consumption, followed by Milpitas and, trickling out to our smaller jurisdictions. And that's just for the non-residential buildings. And then the chart here on the right shows you the residential consumption, average monthly for 2017. So what are our residents using? So the bars show you total consumption for that sector. And then the green line shows you the monthly electricity consumption by household. So it's interesting how there's a little bit of an inverse chart here where the smaller towns and cities are using more electricity per household. And I don't think that this is going to surprise many of us, or many of you at all. And then we wanted to spend some time looking at the residential building stock. So this pie chart in the middle shows you the electricity consumption by housing type. So single-family housing uses 83% of electricity in the residential sector versus multifamily housing, which uses about 15%. And this is in contrast to the pie chart on the left, which shows you that single-family housing only makes up 63% of the total housing units across the service territory. And this is driven by the fact that single-family homes is estimated to use about twice as much as a multifamily unit. Condos, apartments, and then mobile homes, fall somewhere in between. So just to give you a flavor for how the types of housing that we build influences how much electricity and how much energy people use in their homes. So digging a little bit deeper, looking at what types of housing does each city have. You can see the light blue and the darker blue shows single-family housing, and then the green parts of the bar show you the number of dwelling units for the multifamily type housing. So again, not surprising, our smaller towns and cities have more single-family homes, and then the larger cities have a little bit more balanced between single-family and multifamily. So housing size is one driver of electricity consumption, but housing vintage, when were the homes built? So this data is pulled from the US Census and American Community Survey, and you really see, the number of housing units being built, kind of peaking before 1979, which incidentally, the statewide Building Energy Code, Title 24, was kind of adopted or launched in 1979. And I think one of our MOG members said, oh, well, when you look at this chart, it kind of explains our housing situation these days. So that was a bit of a tangent, but it is interesting to see kind of when the homes were built, in our cities. The other attribute that we looked at was whether or not homes are owner or renter occupied. This has impacts on how we design our energy programs. Split incentive is a real issue when we're thinking about investments for energy upgrades. And so what we see here is, kind of mirrors the multifamily versus single family trends, where, some of the bigger cities have, more of the renters, and then, the smaller towns with the big homes tend to be owner occupied. So shifting gears here a little bit from energy use to energy supply. So we wanted to look at the clean energy assets. And so solar PV is definitely one that we've all been kind of watching that market grow. And here we pulled the data for SVCE specifically for 2012 to 2017, and this is cumulative installed capacity for solar PV. Dark blue is non-residential installations, and light blue is residential. So, what's interesting is that the residential market has actually increased quite quickly and outpaces the commercial sector or the non-residential sector. And overall, the residential sector has about 101 megawatts versus non-residential, which is about 60 megawatts, for a total installed capacity of about 162 megawatts, which represents about a 5% of the total load. So everybody wants to know what it looks like for their own city. So here's a glimpse at how much solar is installed by member jurisdiction. And again, the chart shows the dark blue is non-residential and light blue is residential. So it's interesting that Cupertino has so much non-residential solar PV. I wonder what could be driving, what corporate entity could be driving that trend. And then the green line shows the KW installed per service population. Okay, Steve's celebrating. Yes, congratulations to Los Altos Hills for having the highest installed capacity per service population. Or lowest. And again, service population is number of residents plus number of jobs. So somehow Steve got there without any real jobs in there. So yeah, I think those are the main takeaways from that graph. So battery storage is another hot topic. We talked earlier about the duck curve and how do we become good grid citizens, and so this is where we really want to explore what is the baseline battery storage situation in SVCE territory today. So the data source isn't listed here, but we pulled data from the Self-Generation Incentive Program, the SGIP program. So this is a statewide program. It was the only readily available data source available. So it might be that it's not complete, but it gives you kind of a snapshot, and it allows us to continue to track annually what the installed capacity for battery storage is. So in this chart, we show, let's start with the pie chart. The pie chart shows the number of installations. So light blue is commercial, green is residential, and then the dark blue is government. So when you look at who's installed, which of the jurisdictions have the most installed capacity for batteries, Mountain View does lead the way. And let's see. And what's interesting is that Los Altos actually shows up in here related to the government sector. or the school, okay, so it's related to the schools. But given the small sample size here, you know, a project like at the schools, it can definitely skew the data, so to speak. So that's something to keep in mind as, you know, it's a nascent industry and it's growing. And I've heard some folks say that, you know, storage is riding on the coattails of solar. So as solar is expanding, you know, storage is starting to kind of become a more urgent issue. So we wanted to compare, so this next bar chart shows in green the battery storage capacity compared to the solar generation capacity. So this might be an area where a little bit more analysis is needed to figure out, you know, how much battery storage needs to be sized to address the duck curve. I don't think it's a one-for-one. You know, we're talking about storing the solar generated in the middle of the day. So I think to figure out how much battery storage we really should be targeting will require a little bit more analysis.
Can you comment on the data sources between solar and battery?
Yes, absolutely. So the solar PV is from the, I think the California Solar Initiative data. So it's here on this chart. So the CSI solar statistics website. So anybody can go there and pull that data, but we've gone ahead and pulled it for all the member jurisdictions. And, you know, Don will talk a little bit more about the workbook and how we're just making it a little bit easier for everybody to access this data. Okay, so that's the CSI data, and then the storage was pulled from the Self-Generation Incentive Program data. Okay. So, you know, it might be worth thinking about, you know, how do we look at that data, and if we don't think the SCHIP is, you know, a complete enough data source, then I think we also try to look at the Bloomberg Energy Finance as well, but we can talk more about that. So,
There has been more than 0 battery installations in Saratoga.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure there's something missing.
Yeah, I don't think it's you're right, it's not 0, but it's arguably towards 0. Okay, so those are the clean energy assets, and we also wanted to look at some of the other generation distributed sources here in the service territory. You know, the Self-Generation Incentive Program does also fund other types of distributed resources. And so here are some of the other types of technologies. I think I'll start with the pie chart again here on the right, where it shows across the service territory about of the installed capacity of these other generation sources, 70% is related to just a pure natural gas fuel cell. And then the blue is internal combustion, microturbine, and then this tiny little green wedge here on the right is the natural gas fuel cell with combined heat and power. And, you know, and so a note about this is that, you know, fuel cells can be cleaner when they're used with heat recovery, like a combined heat and power, but most of the fuel cells installed here in the area is just running on pure natural gas. So it's kind of like having a, you know, a mini natural gas power plant. And so shifting your attention back here to the bar charts on the left, it shows you where some of these technologies are installed. But I will note that the SCHIP program is no longer funding just internal combustion and the microturbines. But my understanding is that it is still funding the natural gas fuel cells.
Do you have carbon data for this?
So the natural gas consumption is rolled into those bars. So it is rolled into the inventory. Yeah, so it is in there. And so if you look at the rated capacity compared to battery storage, the battery storage is about 2 megawatts, and these other types of sources is about 18 or 19 megawatts. So it, you know, pure battery storage is still emerging compared to these other systems. Yeah, next. Okay, electric vehicles, everybody's favorite topic. And so this is the final clean energy technology that we looked at in developing this baseline asset inventory. So as you had seen in the transportation emissions chart, most of the vehicles in the territory are fossil fueled. And one thing to note is, which I'm actually very happy, we were able to pull actual vehicle registration data from Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV. So this is actual vehicle registration data for across the 13 jurisdictions. And you can see total number of registered vehicles in SVCE territory as of last fall is about 886,000 vehicles. And of those, about 1.2% are electric vehicles, and DMV states that about 4.6% is plug-in hybrid, but we really think that that's incorrect, and that it includes a lot of traditional hybrid vehicles that early on were able to get the clean vehicle stickers, the HOV stickers, and so that they got rolled into that bucket. So that's just something to note, that from the DMV, that's a piece that we don't think is quite right. But if you look at this table here on the bottom, the number of electric vehicles is 14,000 electric vehicles, and then the plug-in hybrid that's the number associated with the 4.6%.
I have a quick question.
Of course.
So some of us, well, there's maybe not that many, but some of us have hydrogen vehicles. Would these be rolled into the electric vehicle category, or will there eventually be a hydrogen vehicle category?
That's a great question. I'm not sure where the hydrogen...
I believe there was an other category.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah, it was very small.
Yeah, very small, but it's growing. I see more of them.
Okay. Okay, and so this next chart shows you the growth in EV and plug-in hybrid. So DMV runs their vehicle registration data twice a year, March and September. So this chart shows you from 2015 through 2017, so 3 years of vehicle registration data for electric vehicles as shown in dark blue, and plug-in hybrids in light blue. So we think that the growth rate is actually correct because the HOV stickers were ended before this period. So the growth rate that we're seeing in EVs, in battery EVs, is over 100% over 3 years, and then about 30% for the plug-in hybrids. And another fun fact here is, of new vehicles being purchased, how many are EVs? So you can see here at the bottom, Santa Clara County, 5% of new vehicles is estimated to be electric vehicles, and that's that surpasses the other counties. So we do a little round of applause now. So that's great news. And then, of course, with electric vehicles comes the infrastructure and the charging infrastructure. So we wanted to look at, how well are we set up at this time to support growth in electric vehicles. And this shows the published EV chargers. So this is publicly available EV chargers by city. And we use a couple of different data sources here at the bottom. Although I think it's primarily from the DOE's Alternative Fuels Data Center, the AFDC. With chargers, EV chargers, you have the different charging levels. And so of the public chargers, most of those that are published are level 2. But one thing, when we were doing the research and talking to sort of the EV charging companies, they anecdotally mentioned that, well, we only publish about 5 to 10% of what's actually in our network, because only 5 to 10% is publicly available, and the others are related to workplace charging or in private kind of multifamily units or other places that are not public. So the public chargers we've captured here in the data set is about 585. So that corresponds to the bar chart. And then if you take the 5 to 10% back of the envelope estimate, we estimate that in the workplace, might be on the range of 8,000. And then of home and residential charging, we thought, well, maybe about 90% of EV owners, have their own, ability to charge at their home, although it might be just a level 1. So that one's also a little bit of a kind of best estimate as well.
So how many municipalities have free charging for their employees? The answer is 1. I'm waiting for the rest of you guys.
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn to take it home.
In summary.
In summary.
Okay, we have one last slide here that's, I think, intended to be thought-provoking. But if we look at the far right bar, which is storage, so this is battery storage, we're currently at about 3.3 megawatt hours in terms of what could be supplied annually. If we look at natural gas fuel cells, 90,000. If we look at our entire solar PV production, 283,000 megawatt hours. And if we considered the amount of energy stored in electric vehicle batteries, okay, that the 1 or 2% that we have out there already, and if you cycled half of that battery each day back into the grid, 328,000 megawatt hours. So there is a vast storage resource being developed in EVs that might represent a real opportunity. So it's interesting to look at where we are with respect to these different technologies relative to the overall problem and opportunity. So you spend a lot of time on this, but we may come back to analyses like this going forward. And then finally, as we started out by saying, we're making these data sets available to basically to anyone, but it's our municipal partners that are particularly interested in that are using this as part of their climate action planning efforts. Okay. We're going to be updating the GHG inventory data annually, and you can go into the tool, you can slice and dice, certainly by city or by other attributes, and see how you're doing year over year. So a good foundational data set for support of municipal GHG tracking and climate action planning efforts. So that's it for our presentation. Happy to open it up for questions.
Great, thank you very much for that thorough presentation. Are there any questions? Yes, Director Miller. So
in the consent calendar, we approved sort of an extension to this work to kind of wrap it up, and I'm wondering what work is remaining. And the corollary request is, can we get a better look at what battery storage is installed? Because from my own building permit data, I am led to believe that this data doesn't reflect some of what's going on in the residential space, at least in the small scale stuff.
So we can certainly take an additional look at that.
And then I was just trying to figure out what else was left to be done, because this seems so good.
We're very close to finished. It was extended mainly because I think the contract went through June 30th, and our presentation is here on July 11th, and we wanted to include Betty. So so we're close to finished, but we can certainly look at items like that or answer any specific questions. I think what's happening there is, you'll notice Saratoga did appear with a bar, granted a very small bar, and you think your bar is bigger than that, but we will look at some of this has to do with what's actually installed versus what's applied for. So this may be based on SGIP money that's made it all the way through the process and's been paid out. So we may be seeing a bit of a timing issue here.
Other questions? Yes, Director Smith.
Yes, thank you for the comprehensive report. I was distracted when you mentioned there was a tool. So would you repeat how we can get to the data, if that's available yet? And
So it's a spreadsheet tool. You're looking at kind of what the home page for it. It looks like it's an Excel model with a lot of data behind it.
Yeah.
So can we have it?
Okay, thank you.
Can we have it?
Is there a link
so-
to it, or so we will be able to access the tool?
Yes, it's available to anybody that wants to access it. The primary users have been the people that are on the MOG, for instance, that are working with climate action planning activities day to day.
And Don, have you thought about any process for making upgrades as we go through it on a city-by-city basis and we find minor problems?
Sounds like something Betty can think about in her remaining time. No, we will certainly note those issues in it, and if there are fundamental issues with the data in there, we'll want to address those. If it's a matter of what we can incorporate next year, we'll record that and deal with it then.
That's right.
Is there any other questions from the side? No? Go to, yes.
Yes, I just have a question. I'm assuming you can hear me. I have a question related to the transportation data. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned, the difference between the commercial and the non-commercial. But as we got further into the data, it seemed like it was combined. Can you clarify if that data is combined, for example, on slide 10, and then on the electric and plug-in hybrids expansion on slide 20?
Yes, so, slide 10. Okay, Dawn's going back to that. So yes, that includes both the commercial and the passenger vehicles.
Okay, so as we decarbonize the public transportation system, my assumption is VTA will make that data more readily available, and that will also shift this in the
Yes.
future years.
That's right. Yeah, VTA will make that data available. We're primarily pulling the data from MTC. So yeah, but those data sets do include the vehicle mix for both commercial and passenger vehicles.
Okay, thank you.
And Director Gibbons, did you have a question?
Thank you. During the presentation, you made reference to a couple of different sources and websites. Hopefully that those links will be provided to us as part of that. That would be great. As an aside, I noticed Bloom Energy is going public this week, I think. And if you look at the chart on battery storage, maybe it's actually probably what I'm looking for is one of these charts on the solar photovoltaic capacity is growing rapidly. Am I correct that we are still mandated to provide the power demand for solar users, and we cannot take credit for what's provided by solar users or solar providers? Do you know what I'm talking about? It had to do with our procurement discussions early on in our...
Right. So, yeah, we don't get credit for the solar that comes back onto the grid from distributed resources, if that's what you're asking. That doesn't show up in our mix.
Right. So I just, for future reference, this is an interesting analysis that might come in to influence that going forward with any legislation or whatever. I thought that was very interesting. And on the chart that says electricity consumption by city and sector, energy use, if I'm following the diagram correctly, how will this diagram change with our new contract, which was going to impact the duck curve, the one that we're doing in, is it New Mexico?
The slide?
Am I understanding that correctly?
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again?
Okay. So it says residential average monthly total and per household electricity consumption. Let's see, one of these tables. I may be looking at the wrong table. Slide 13, okay. I don't have numbers on what I'm looking at.
Can you get the slide up?
Which one are you looking at?
Is it this one?
This one?
Yeah. Oh, little numbers down there, okay. What I'm trying to understand is that how these might change in the future. And the fact that we have a new contract from New Mexico that's going to have, we think, a major impact on our duck curve of when we have power produced overnight. So how that will change some of these tables in the future.
So this table reflects the average monthly usage. That's what you see on the green line. So that really wouldn't be impacted by a different supply mix. And then the blue bars represent the overall consumption monthly for that community. So
okay, I'll look and see if I can find it. There was that thought came to me when I was looking at one of the tables, but I'll figure that one out, and perhaps need to ask you again. Okay. Oh, and then if you look at table 11 or page 11, to me, this diagram here and your comment about the 20% and how we're going to get to the additional 10%. Melpitas will help us with some of that. But doesn't this really highlight how important our programs are going to be?
yes, the 20% does factor in Milpitas.
Oh, it does,
so
okay.
We're already getting that benefit here.
Okay.
So it is 10% that we want to address through programmatic efforts. There's also structural things going on, like the fuel standard, the CAFE standards are helping reduce some of the emissions in the traditional vehicle segment, so gas-powered vehicles are getting a little more efficient. And this is what we're going to be working on modeling and what Amy is going to be helping us with as we do our program planning work over the next 6 months.
So to me, this was probably one of the most significant tables going forward.
Right.
Okay.
I think I'd like to make a comment that relates to your question related to the duck curve and sort of where the electricity comes from. And this is where, how do you influence how much energy people use? And, time of use rates is certainly an important part of that in addressing the duck curve. And so, when we look at programs and we look at approaches to influence behavior, there's a suite of, tools in the toolbox. And the remaining 10% here, you can see that the green piece has gone down, related to electricity has gone down quite a bit, and so that's also why there's a lot of attention paid to the transportation piece in blue and the natural gas, especially in brown.
And the natural gas, and maybe you can give us a tool like Dawn's clock that changes, so we can see the impact of all the tools.
Actually, I'd love to be able to use that.
Did you have a question?
Yes, so Don, can you go back to slide 3? At the top it says the GHG emissions baseline data is 2 primary sectors, the built environment and the transportation, and excludes water and wastewater and so on. And I remember we did that because we want to capture and track the parts of the GHG inventory that we have some control over. So Director Bailey is going to be focusing on built environment and transportation. She's probably not going to do a lot of stuff with wastewater and septic tanks.
Exactly, and that remaining slice of the pie varies quite a bit by jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions may have very small slices, others, say with a waste treatment plant, might have a larger segment. So
that's my question. On the next page, it seems like the 5% of waste and wastewater is included in the baseline.
It's not included.
It's
so
not.
that
Okay,
4.24 does not include any number. That we drew that in just so we had a circle, so we had a full pie, and so that you could see what the relative impact of the built environment and the transportation sector are. They're a substantial majority of the pie.
So on slide 11, one more, then it looks like it's included in the baseline. at the very top of the bar chart.
I'm getting there.
And by the way, this information is fantastic. It's,
Yeah.
you've done a great job.
Yeah.
But this makes it appear that waste and wastewater is part of the baseline.
You're right, it does. Yeah,
Just
we'll
have to extend
we'll address that.
Director Smith, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to say I think this is timely information to give to the Rocky Mountain Institute. It seems like it would be very helpful for setting up our programs. I think it's fairly clear that that we know kind of what would help address these emission gaps, like where the most effort put in could make the most payback. I think this is a fabulous baseline, and I'm hoping that my colleagues will promote this and make this that their cities aware of this, their colleagues on councils, that sort of thing, because it is fabulous. Now I have a question because I sit on the Caltrain local policymaker group for Caltrain electrification and that sort of thing. Would it be at all possible to include trains in this? Because I don't believe that you've included. I mean, does this include trains and buses? And
it includes buses. It does not include trains. It doesn't include Caltrain.
Okay. So
is there a way
to do that?
Yeah. I mean, we could. We've certainly included Caltrain, the current diesel consumption, in most of the city inventories. So for the time being, we could. I'm looking at Dawn, but we could, incorporate the Caltrain diesel consumption today, and then for conceivably, looking ahead into full Caltrain electrification. What the timing of that is, that gets a little.
I don't think there's a hurry, is my my point, but maybe in the upcoming. Did I hear you say that we'd be updating this every year?
Yes.
Okay. Oh. And then and that's fabulous. Is this okay? So I know that several cities have climate action plans. Can they use this data to baseline their? Or is
the cities are on different timing relative to when they're updating their plans, but they can come and get this data for whatever year they may want to use, especially over time as we get this going. We want to make the basic transportation and built environment GHG data available each year.
Yeah, I know. I'll speak back to some of the earlier comments that some of the members of the public have made at, I think it was the executive committee meeting. Would it be possible to add a chart of some kind about maybe comparing like a decay curve approach for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a fixed percentage every year versus a fixed, amount of like overall reductions, just to kind of help educate people. Because I mean, there's a target and I don't see any like progress toward a goal kind of slide. So that I think would be very helpful with the different approaches of what a decay curve would look like versus a.
So it's a great point, and as we move really into the heavy program planning work and the modeling work that Amy's going to help us with, we will be starting to draw some lines into the future, and those lines may not be lines; they might be curves, and I'm sure there'll be a robust bit of conversation around what the shape of those trajectories look like.
Okay, great.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'll just make a few comments as well. And I want to echo the comments that were made because they were all really excellent as well. But I also wanted to add one item, is slide number 11, which we discussed, which is already on the screen. It really shows the collective work in impacting GHG reductions. I know individually for the climate action plan, we really do our own individual reports for cities. I know when we wanted to start joining Milpitas, that was one of the conversations Don had. He was like, this is going to really help you out, Odessa, with your climate action plan. This is a good thing. So, of course, the individual report that you have is going to be extremely helpful. However, we also have a community-wide newsletter that goes out to residents, and it's good for them to know how they have impacted the regionalism. How have they, as a whole, we as a whole have impacted the whole community, which is the Bay Area. So I think that's also a good point to share with staff and for our council as well to share it with the leadership and staff. So otherwise, I think it's, as it was already stated, the future programming is can be definitely based on this. I can definitely see programming coming out on EV and charging stations, storage and EV vehicles, and I think that's about it. I already said that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to go to our CEO, and then I'm going to open up for public comment.
Yeah. So I think based on some of the requests we've got, once we've finalized all the data, we can prepare a packet for each of you that you can then turn in to your city manager with the PowerPoint presentation, all the references, the spreadsheets, and maybe a bit of a cheat sheet of how to use it with contact information if folks want to get back to us. Several of the largest cities are part of the member agency working group, and they have access to it and they're very familiar with it, but we'll just send it out to everyone once we finish all the details here.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to go to public comment. If there's any member of the public wishing to speak, please come forward. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks. I think it's really exciting to have data, and now we have so much data that it's hard to remember why we're excited. I guess I have 3 minutes and I have 5 points I want to raise, so I'll be rapid. Mountain View just completed a citizen-led environmental sustainability task force that recommended 36 specific actions to the Mountain View City Council. And I'm going to reiterate some of those for your benefit because I think that there's a great connection. So the first one I want to mention is per capita goals and measurement versus absolute goals and measurement. So most of what we've seen on the slides are absolutes. This is how many tons it was in 2015. This is how much it was in 2017. The goals that the CEO mentioned had to do with a reduction in an absolute sense. But over time, this county is going to be growing. Some parts of it are going to be growing very rapidly, both with jobs and housing. Other parts not growing very much. And I think that if you frame your goals in per capita terms, not just your goals, but your measurements in per capita terms, you'll be able to do a couple of things. One is you'll be able to not get discouraged if the absolute emissions are not falling as rapidly as you wanted when population is growing at the same time. Certainly in Milpitas, I was in Milpitas today and saw the housing growth next to the new BART station. I know that Mountain View has plans to grow dramatically, but other cities don't. And so if you focus on per capita, everybody will be on a level playing field. The other thing is a piece of bad news, which is that these measures of emissions ignore about half of the emissions that we humans are responsible for. So we heard that we're ignoring the Caltrain. We're also ignoring all air travel. We're ignoring the emissions associated with the food choices we make. We're ignoring emissions associated with the leakage of natural gas. We're measuring the CO2 from burning it, but the leakage of natural gas makes it a fuel that's on a par with coal in terms of its GHG impact. Natural gas is evil, and we need to do everything we can to stop any new natural gas infrastructure, whether that be houses that are hooked up to PG&E's gas lines or bloom boxes, from being installed in our jurisdiction. And the faster we can ban them, the better off the climate will be. The other thing I will say is that if you're going to have goals for something, you should have a goal for every single year. Because if you don't do that, people will infer a goal between the goals that you have set. And the way they infer that will be a linear extrapolation between the points. As was mentioned by Councilmember Smith, linear is not necessarily the way to set a reduction goal. A decay curve is actually a better way to do it. So let's be explicit up front. Let's set a goal for every year, and let's have those goals decline on a constant percentage basis rather than by a constant amount. I think my time must be up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have James Tilia. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, James Tilia, resident of Sunnyvale. I really appreciate the work and having all this data, so I'll repeat that. I think that it's great to have baseline data. A couple of comments about some things I see in the data, as well as if there's other data, I'm not aware of it yet. But so I noticed natural gas trends, which we know is a challenge, and even you can use other terms for it as well. And you see that the residential, on slide 9, residential's increased 7.2%. So it's very important to find out what's happening with that. Why is that? Is that all population growth? It doesn't seem like it would be. Maybe it's population growth plus increase in wealth. So understanding that. But generally is that what I see is that there's a lot more attention, even though the usage is more commercial but there's a lot more residents and they're harder to reach. And so programs toward residential, I think, are going to be very important because the trends are going the wrong direction. On the commercial side, as far as the data goes for having baseline, having designed programs at PG&E for 7.5 years, there's different, as Don well knows, and he probably knows all the details about it, but there's different segments within commercial. And so I don't yet see segments of small business versus large business, and the middle as well. But large business, they've got resources, they do things, and it is where most of the use is and most of the opportunity. But in designing programs and the opportunity for programs, what SVC can look to do broadly is filling gaps. Who's not being served? The small business is likely an area that is already underserved, and I know that to be true from working at PG&E, and this doesn't give us any data to look at the small business. So how are we ever going to fill that gap and measure our success in helping our small businesses? So that's another, their ability to understand and manage their energy use is much more like a residential customer than a medium or large business. So they need more help, to put it simply. And I agree with the let's do what we can to stop more of this alternative use of natural gas for generation in bloom boxes, etc. They moved out of Sunnyvale, so now I'm not dissing my own. They moved down to Gilroy or Morgan Hill or something? I don't know. So anyway, it's a challenge that we have to address, as well as DA. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wishing to speak? Do you? No? Okay, great. I'll bring it back to the board. Any other last minute comments?
Yeah, Betty, a question. They both mentioned natural gas leakage rates. I thought we'd used a pretty aggressive or pretty up-to-date leakage rate.
So we did not factor the leakage rate into these numbers. Okay. And the reason we didn't do that was because the convention right now for GHG reporting among jurisdictions, right or otherwise, doesn't generally include that leakage rate. In the report, we list what we would assume it would be. We didn't share that here, again, because we're a little concerned about an apples and apples conversation. But to the point that the speakers made, yeah, it does bump up natural gas by another 50% or so. I mean, it's a big hit if you look at leakage. Now, leakage is considered all the way from the source, literally from the wellhead, and then you start getting into the arcane GHG arguments of, well, should that be reported and captured somewhere else versus in the city? Long story short, gas is really impactful to the environment and is probably underrepresented in the way that traditional accounting is done here.
I remember at the MOG we saw an early version of the workbook, and that leakage information was in the workbook for each of the different jurisdictions. Yeah. That's still there?
Yeah.
And it almost doubled the impact of natural gas.
Yes, Director Givens.
So you've just gotten me confused. I actually followed your point, but in terms of what cities need to complete their climate action plan, the document and the information as being presented with the tweaks we've talked about is what cities need irrespective of the gas leak issue.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So that was actually my question, is the relationship between the city plans and with this data, and are there areas that the cities may have more information or details on that we can plug into ours, so that eventually ours is the comprehensive plan that any city can pull from at any time?
So when we put together our approach with the MOG for doing this, we talked a lot about common denominators and trying to work on putting together a data set that would be generally useful to all jurisdictions. Not every city, but a few cities are doing, maybe they're accounting for transportation slightly differently, or some cities include air travel, or so again, we don't mean this to be the inventory for every city. What we mean it to be is a really good repository with most of the data that a city would need to do a conventional inventory. If you want to do something above and beyond that,
it's up to the cities to do that. Great. All right. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting and well done. We will move on to, sorry, and we kind of got off schedule, but that's okay. We'll move to item 7. I have a short executive committee report. The executive committee met on June 26 and reviewed and provided feedback on the strategic plan, which was presented this evening. The committee also discussed a proposed new joint power authority or joint power authorities, which will be brought to the full board once more information becomes available. Staff has requested to cancel the July 24th executive committee meeting due to a light agenda. If acceptable with the board, the next regularly scheduled executive committee meeting will be held Tuesday, September 25th. And that concludes my report. Are there any questions to the report? Any members of the public wishing to comment? So do we need to vote on canceling the meeting? No? Okay. If that's acceptable to the board members, we will cancel July 24th. And we'll move on to item number 8, Finance and Administration Committee report by the Chair, Director Craig. Do you have a report?
Thank you. Sure do.
Great.
We met on June the 19th in a special meeting to discuss the benefits and compensation. And we are going to have another meeting on Monday, July 23rd to continue this discussion and provide feedback and suggestions. And that's it for the report.
Thank you. Any questions on the report? Any members of the public wishing to speak on the item? If not, thank you. We'll move on to item number 9, Legislative Ad Hoc Committee report. There was no report as the committee has not met since May 7th. However, the next meeting of the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee is scheduled for Tuesday, July 17th. And any questions? Members of the public? All right, thank you. I love this interactive meeting style. So that concludes our regular calendar. Are there any board member announcements or direction on future agenda items? Yes, Director Harney.
Yeah, just a couple of announcements. First, well, he just came back in the room. Peyton, thanks for coming back. We had the pleasure of Peyton joined the Gilroy Chamber of Commerce last month for our monthly breakfast, and he was announced as a new member representing Silicon Valley Clean Energy and also a hometown local environmental hero. Nice. So that was really cool. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.
The second announcement is just to invite everyone, the board of directors, to the annual Garlic Festival that's occurring starting on July 27th. As most of you probably know by now, it's one of the largest festivals held in the Bay Area. There's over 100,000 people that come from all over the world to join us down in the South County. But this year there'll be 200,000 eyeballs looking at Silicon Valley Clean Energy since SVCE has committed to provide clean energy at the at the event. So every single musical stage will be powered by clean energy.
Wow.
And that was a lot of work done by Pamela and others on the team to make that happen. So I invite all of the public to join, and also the board members here. And as I understand it, it's also the annual family day for the staff, who will be invited down to the Garlic Festival on Friday, which is, I think, the best day because it's the locals' day. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
So we'll get the free garlic?
We will give you free garlic ice cream. Yeah.
Any other directors? No? Anything from staff? If not, we stand adjourned at 9:20. Thank you very much. We are off in August, so we will see you back in September. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Family. Whether it's a short trip or a long haul.
Estimated time, 47 hours.
They will beg.
You're hungry? I'm happy to provide.
They will plead.
Deep fried butter on a stick.
But whatever you do, don't wimp out.
Now you're talking.
Make them buckle up.
He can't hurt.
Remember, safety first. Cheese curls second.
Are you